Thank you. And welcome to everybody who's joining us. It's been an exciting 2 weeks for all of us in CMMC land. So we're happy to dive in today and start talking about CFR 48. So this is just a real quick agenda. We're going to do some CMMC level setting, talking kind of about the program at a higher level, and then also what 48 CFR means for you. I know that's the part that everybody's really the most excited to hear about. And also, what do you need to do now that CFR 48 is going to be in effect? We're also going to leave some time for Q&A at the end, but we're not going to leave a whole bunch of time for Q&A, just so everybody's clear on that, because we do have breakout rooms that you'll be able to access at the end of this session. So at the top of the hour, Orly will provide different links. We'll have two different breakout rooms. One of them is going to be more for people who are kind of just getting started with CMMC or consider themselves more CMMC novice. And then there's going to be a second breakout room that's going to be for those who are more advanced and more farther along with their CMMC implementation and their questions. So again, we will leave some time for Q&A at the end, but we're going to have those individual dedicated breakout rooms at the end of this session. So just stay tuned for that. Thank you so much, Orly. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And first and foremost, my name is Noël Vestal. I am the Chief Compliance Officer here at PreVeil. I have implemented CMMC myself at what was one of the very first C3PAOs to come out. And if you're not aware of what a C3PAO is, that's a CMMC assessing organization. I've also been here at PreVeil for almost 4 years, working with hundreds of customers, helping them to get compliant. I'm also a certified CMMC assessor. But I am joined by people who are far more esteemed than I. Starting first off with Tom Tollerton. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Noel. Certainly appreciate it. I'm Tom Tollerton. I'm a principal at Forvis Mazars. We're one of the earliest authorized C3PAOs back in 2022 and then reauthorized again this year. But I lead our CMMC practice. And, as you mentioned, we're all kind of excited right now. CMMC is finally here. We're right on the precipice of full enforcement and looking forward to the conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Tom, and especially on such short notice. And Michael, same for you. Thank you so much for being here. And if you could just share a little bit about yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Noel. Great to see everybody. My name is Michael Gruden. I'm a partner at Crowell Moring. I sit between our privacy and cybersecurity group and government contracts practice. Essentially, the intersection of the two is where I spend all my time counseling companies on implementing the government's cybersecurity requirements, NIST, CMMC, and et cetera. I'm a registered practitioner, and I also sit on the appeals board with the Cyber AB, the accreditation body for the CMMC program. And before coming to Crowell, I actually worked for the government for 15 years as a contracting officer, first at the Department of Homeland Security, and then later at the Pentagon, where I was an IT acquisition branch chief. So often help companies navigate cyber requirements through that lens, which they find really useful, and excited to be here today.
Oh, we're so happy to have your expertise here, especially on this particular topic. So with that, we're going to jump right in. So CFR 48 has dropped. What does that actually mean? So really quick level set on the top of that. So first of all, for those of you who do not know what CFR 48 is, I'm going to give you a very brief little rundown. And then Tom, I'm going to ask you to level set what that really means for people out there. Like, what does it actually mean that CFR 48 has dropped? CFR 48 is a piece of legislation. So it's a companion piece of legislation for those of you who've been in CMMC. Last year in October, there was the 32 CFR that dropped and then went into effect in December. That is what established CMMC as a program and made it so that this year C3PAOs like Tom and others could go out and actually do assessments on their own without the direct support of the government. Now we have CFR 48. That is sort of the second piece of the puzzle where now they can actually put this into contracts. So CFR 48 makes the legal obligation possible now. So that means that contracting officers can do all kinds of different things that they wouldn't be able to have done before because CMMC is now going to have that second piece of legislation. So Tom, what does that really mean for everyone? And what is this November 10th date I keep hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you hit the nail on the head. There's the two pieces of administrative law, if you will, the 32 CFR rule, which effectively established the program, the CMMC program, the ecosystem, the levels, and so forth. And then the 48 CFR rule in multiple parts that effectively authorizes contracting officers to insert the CMMC clause into Department of Defense, Department of War solicitations and RFPs. And we had the 32 CFR rule. We now have the 48 CFR rule that has been published as final in the Federal Register, which is kind of what we have been waiting on CMMC assessments had begun. There are early adopters. We have, Forvis Mazars, we've been doing a number of assessments, certificate assessments. But now we're going to start to see these actually in solicitations. And that November 10th date that you mentioned is the effective date. It's 60 days from the publication, which was September the 10th. So starting November the 10th, we will start to see solicitations come out that require a CMMC, a requisite CMMC certificate of status for award of a particular contract.
So I heard you say solicitation. Is it only new solicitations after November 10th?
That's a great question. In the comment section of the rule, they actually did state that it's not just for new solicitations, that existing contracts can, and it's at the discretion of the contracting officer based upon the program and nature of information, they can actually implement CMMC requirements into existing contracts and for extensions and so forth. So it's
Pretty much it can
across
go
the board,
anywhere. Yeah.
basically. It's across the
Right.
board. Yep.
Right, exactly. So that's something I think that's very important for our audience to understand. So it's not just new solicitation, it is extensions, it's option years, it's anything. So it's really important to be aware of that. Now, Michael, I'd like to ask you, so I know that we have talked at length here at PreVeil, and I'm sure you have talked even longer about 7012. So for those of you who are not aware of what 7012 is, DFAR 7012, could you just give a very quick recap of that and how that is different than our new DFARs that CFR 48 is going to establish, which is DFAR 7021?
Sure, happy to. So the DFARS safeguarding clause, as many people refer to it, which is the DFARS clause 252-204-7012, it's been around for over a decade now, which is really hard to believe. Remember, we've been counseling on it for that long,
That's
but
crazy.
it is crazy, and it's just like, wow, there's been a long development with DoD cybersecurity requirements. And so again, that clause was released over a decade ago, and what it included was the requirement to comply with the same underlying standard that's in place right now under CMMC, which is NIST Internet 171. That includes 110 security controls. Those same controls are pretty much around for that whole decade. The requirement at the time was to demonstrate compliance through written documentation, and that there was sort of an honor system, if you will, that if you had that clause included in your contract, you had to implement those controls, and then you had to have a system security plan. That's your written documentation that described in sort of a narrative form how you met each of those 110 security controls, and that you also included a network diagram that defined your boundary, which was really essentially your assessment scope. As I mentioned, this was again all in the honor system, meaning that the government presumed that if a contractor had that clause in their contract, that the company would fully implement these controls and have that documentation in place. The other thing that it did permit, though, was plans of actions and milestones, or otherwise referred to as a POAM. That's sort of anytime you don't have a control that you fully meet, you can document that in that same system security plan, and you're still theoretically in compliance with that clause. That's a marked difference when we look towards CMMC, that in the future state, there's only a select number of controls that you can have a POAM, and even for those, you can only have them for 180 days. Otherwise, your certification status would expire. There's two other requirements, though, under the safeguarding clause that we'd flag. The second is the incident reporting mechanism. That's a requirement that really governs that we spend a lot of our time counseling clients on when they have a reportable cyber incident or not, and or leading privileged forensic investigations to determine if they need to report to the DoD. But essentially, if you have a cyber incident that affects controlled unclassified information, there's a requirement to report to the DoD within 72 hours of discovery. The third requirement is, again, subcontractor flowdowns. That sort of introduced and led the way for subcontractor requirements, meaning if you have subcontractors that are also handling regulated data, like controlled unclassified information, you had to flow down that same DFARS clause to them and ensure that they also met it.
So I love that you said the honor system.
Yeah.
We were talking about DFAR 7012, and thank you for that review. That was a perfect review of DFAR 7012. Like you said, it's been here for a decade, and it was based on the honor system. Um,
It was.
did the honor system work very well, Michael, or perhaps not?
I would say that the government would not state that it was, because again, that really was the impetus sort of for this whole CMMC development, was essentially the government determined that despite having this clause in place and in contracts, that they still were seeing such a prevalence of cyber attacks, particularly regarding contractors and even, frankly, smaller subcontractors that were handling regulated data like that CUI that I was referring to. And they again determined that that honor system, by incorporating that contract clause, really did not work, and that they needed to migrate towards a system that was requiring self-assessment and then more ultimately towards sort of external assessment.
That verification step, right?
Exactly.
Right. So DFAR 7021 will be in contracts. Basically, that is the verification, right? I mean,
It
for
is.
all intents and purposes. And I also want to point out and really stress this to everyone who's listening in the audience, because you mentioned the subcontractor flow down.
Yeah.
So this was something that was definitely established in 32 CFR, but I think it would be good for us to revisit real quick if you could make that statement of, is it just the first tier of subcontractors? Is it the second tier? How many subcontractors does the prime need to be responsible for this?
Sure. I would say it again, sort of, I think you maybe mentioned earlier on, you really have to follow your data, which is kind of, again, a euphemism that I use quite routinely. But when we're talking about cyber supply chain risk management, when we're counseling companies, it's really critical that you understand where and how deep in your supply chain that same regulated data flows down. And what I mean by that is you might just have one level below you where that supplier may need to handle CUI in order to perform under the contract, or depending upon your industry or business, it may be three levels deep. And depending upon that, that's the degree with which you would need to then flow down these requirements and ensure that they also have the requisite certification. Otherwise, you and your subcontractor would be ineligible to perform under these future government contract requirements.
And we'll definitely get in a little bit later into more of the legal ramifications of when you don't do those things in this conversation, because that is an important one to cover. But yeah, thank you. That was perfect. So now that we've kind of level set what CFR 48 means, what is this new DFAR 7021 clause, what is that going to mean for all of you out there who are DoD contractors who are going to maybe have this clause in a contract? What does that mean for you? So, Tom, if I'm going to be having this DFAR 7021 clause. I have a DFAR 7012 clause right now. I'm going ahead and assuming I'm probably going to have a DFAR 7021. I'm probably going to have to get an assessment by a third party assessor organization. Okay, but what does this all mean? Is this just something I do once? Like I just get an assessment one time and then I'm done? Is this something? What does it really mean to be CMMC certified?
Yeah, there's a big rush right now to get to that certified status, so to speak, and get that level two certificate of status. And we've been talking about it forever. There are a lot of companies getting
Forever.
ready to move forward. So that, we're sort of at this climax, if you will, of CMMC. And the concern is, once companies get there, they're done. But the reality of this and the objective, frankly, of DoD is to make this implement cybersecurity as a process within the organization, something that is consistent, that is ongoing. This does not end with a level two certificate. There are, it is a 3-year life cycle when you work with a C3PAO,
Is it
but
only every 3 years or what if I change something in my implementation? Does
well,
that
that's where I was going to go. There's you have to track, and sort of what Michael was saying. You have to track your information. You have to track your subcontractors. You have to track changes to your own environment, and then consider reassessment if it's a significant change. So there is a requirement for that. There's the off-year affirmations of management. So it's not 3 years completely. It's internal self-assessment in years 2 and 3. So the objective here really needs to be to build a sustainable cybersecurity program that is in compliance with NIST 800-171, because that, the framework's going to change as well. We're going to get to revision 3 of NIST 800-171. There'll be new controls. So this is an ongoing, living, breathing program with DoD, and not a one time and you're done.
Yeah,
Or
absolutely. Yeah, I love that you said that it's changing the whole idea at the company. It's focusing on being secure, being compliant. And Michael, I'm sorry, did you have something you wanted to add too?
no, this is great. I was just gonna sort of add on to Tom's really great comment about sort of needing to maintain currency. That's something that else that I think that's really interesting and notable in this CMMC clause rule that was just finalized is that it included various new terms of art with new definitions. And again, being a pesky attorney, I can't help but really zero in on this and be like, I wonder what this means for our clients. And I think one of the ones that's the most relevant is frankly the definition of the term current. we might think, well, obviously I know what that means, but it really is a more loaded term and a newer term with regards to the CMMC clause rule, because it's used to define a current CMMC status. And specifically within that, the DoD stated that that means that there's no changes in compliance. No changes is a very, specific and finite term. And so when we get back to sort of looking at our network and determining if there's been any changes in our infrastructure and our technical solutions, even in the scope or the boundaries, I think that there's a lot to contemplate there of when there may need to be an additional or a new certification as a result of this new language.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And since we're talking about implementation and how these things are going to affect, our audience members and, the greater DIB as a whole, maybe we should start talking about something called we've sort of lovingly started referring to as the four-phased rollout approach. So I think we have a slide. This is actually just directly from 32 CFR that just sort of goes down. Thank you so much, Orly. It just goes down through the years, talking about the estimated number of total entities. Thank you. In the sort of four-phase rollout. So it's a little hard to see it, but you can see. So you can, if you squint here, years 1 through 4 are really where we start doing the full rollout, right? And Michael, do you have any additional thoughts on what these rollouts mean and what that actually means for the DIB?
I do. I mean, I think something that's interesting, again, looking at it from a nuanced perspective, is as you mentioned, in the CMMC program rule that was released last October, it did break out 4 phases, and we can certainly unpack that. But one thing that I'll note is that within the actual CMMC clause rule, it doesn't specifically refer to those. It actually characterizes it in a different way, where it actually states that there's a sort of a phase one, which is essentially November 10th through November 9th of 2028. That again, that these requirements sort of writ large will be incorporated really at the discretion of the contracting officer and of the DoD. And that after that time frame, essentially November 10th, 2028, then there will be sort of this mandatory implementation of these clauses. So just to sort of note that again, there isn't that same finite detail included in the clause rule, but taking it back though to the CMMC program rule, it's sort of tracks, but there's also a slight nuance or difference here with sort of the way that it's contemplated. But to sort of think through it in terms of phase one, what that will look like effective November 10th of this year, according to the program rule, again, at the DoD's discretion, if we sort of mash up both the program rule and then the clause rule, what it would look like would be for this next year that there would be requirements at level one of CMMC, which pertains to federal contract information, and then for level two, for holders of CUI, to complete self-assessments and then to upload their self-assessment score into SPURS, the Supplier Performance Risk System. However, I will note that there is a discretionary component, you keep hearing that word again and again, that the DoD could require that external C3PO assessment where you need to go knocking on Tom's door and saying, hey, can you help me out? Because I'm seeing this in my solicitation requirement. There is that opportunity for that to occur. Then 1 year after that, so a year from this November, at that time, there will be much more broader implementation of level 2 C3PO requirements, those external assessments. But in addition, there will be requirements at that point that will be implemented for CMMC level 3. This is for high value critical assets of CUI, and that will require a government-led assessment conducted by DIBCAC, the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center. Some of you might have heard about that or heard of DIBCAC audits being conducted under the DFAR 7020 clause that required internal self-assessments, but also availed the government the right to conduct on-site assessments as well. So 2 years after that, now we're moving into phase three. At that point, there's sort of this statement again that the DoD will then implement much more widespread those C3PO requirements through option exercises. For those of you that aren't familiar, an option exercise is when you have a base contract, you may have optional CLINs or contract years that the contracting officer can elect to award. At that time, when they're actually going to exercise an option to exercise a new term of contract, they can then include that C3PO requirement. And then phase four again comports with what I was mentioning earlier about that November 2028 time. That's really where it's sort of no holds bar, kind of everything, the floodgates open. And then again, you have the self-assessment requirements for every level. You have the C3PO requirements and DIBCAC for sort of everything. So that's the way that we're looking for it to sort of trend. I feel a little bit like a meteorologist over here, but again, that's how we're
I
seeing
didn't
it kind
like
of.
that. Yeah.
That's how we sort of foresee it to sort of play out. But again, there really is this discretionary component of the next 3 years. And so I think there will likely be contract contract-specific and program-specific decisions made by the DoD/the Department of War in determining which requirements these specific either self-assessment or external assessment requirements will apply to.
And I think that's the part we all need to remember. This is very much up to the program manager, up to the contract manager, the agency. It is very specific. So they absolutely, to your point, once we get November 10th of this year, yes, we have this phased rollout, but that does not stop the DoD or the DOW from doing whatever they need to do to ensure that they don't have those risks, right? And if it means including this DFARS clause, they can do that. So it's a very good point. So thank you so much for explaining that phased approach, Michael. So Tom, I know that originally, I feel like do you remember what the original number of estimated organizations were supposed to, need to get a C3PAO assessment? Because I know this is something I get questioned about all the time from customers. Well, I mean, do I really need to get an assessment from a C3PAO? Like, it's probably not even that many people who have to do it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting what they did between the 32 CFR and the 48 CFR in sort of delineating their estimates for assessments and what number of companies and so forth. In the 32 CFR rule, they talked, I think it was roughly 77,000
Yeah.
companies would need assessment at the C3PIO level 2. And then in the 48 CFR rule, they sort of did a little bit different count, and that table we had up earlier sort of showed a little bit of that, in that they talked about information systems that would need assessment, and they started to talk about, well, there could be, an average of 2 assessments per contractor, and they started, just considered it a little bit different. So there might be some confusion there, but essentially they upped the estimate on the number of C3PAO assessments, basically. And we have worked with a number of companies that are large, that have multiple divisions and program managed enclaves and things like that, where they need different assessments because it's just different data and different people are supporting it and so forth. So that is a reality. But that's kind of the delineation. I think it was 118,000 or something like that by year 4, I think was the estimate per year would need it.
I think that's a really good point that you make. It's about the system. So it's not about the entity, it's not about the corporation, the company. That's not what it's about. It's about the information system and whether or not it is or is not processing, transmitting, and storing CUI, correct?
Correct.
Right.
Yes. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that's a very important delineation. It definitely seems like too, based on 32 CFR and 48 CFR, which I've read both of it, it seems like we're having less reliance, over time on these different regulations with self-assessment. Would you feel that way too?
Yep, I do absolutely. And I think DoD sort of alluded to that in the rule, that there will be fewer self-assessments that are going to be required. It will mostly be with the C3PAO third-party assessment.
Yeah, and I know that waivers is something that everybody has been hoping and praying and wishing for. Uh, what did the 32 CFR and 48 CFR reference when it comes to waivers?
Yeah, Michael talked a little bit about that, sort of that there's early on the ability for contracting officers to issue waivers and call it extensions for that third-party assessment. If for whatever reason, again, it's at the discretion of the contracting officer, but it is the potential for not needing that third-party assessment or CMMC compliance in general, based upon the extension granted by that waiver. That's up to the contracting officer again. I think the scuttlebutt is, if you will, that we won't see a lot of those. It will really only be as needed, but Michael may have additional insight into that.
Oh, I would agree. I mean, I think again, it's a very one-off exception. I would not, put all my chips kind of in the waiver bucket by any means. Again, if you know that you're handling regulated data and, government contracting is integral to your business and continued business, then I would not in any way kind of bet on a waiver kind of as a get out of jail free card.
I
Yeah.
think that's the perfect way to say it. That is, your waiver is probably not going to be your get out of jail free card. So yeah, definitely that's perfect. All right. So I also want to point out too, Tom, you had talked about early adopters. I know that currently, and this is something that maybe some of our audience is not aware of, we don't have a whole bunch of C3PAOs who can actually do assessments right now, do we? What's the number at?
No, there's an 81 authorized
That's not a lot.
C3PAOs.
Yeah.
Several hundred, I think, still in the queue, but it's a long journey to kind of get there. So there's a background check for the organization. foreign ownership, conflict of interest. They have to stand up their own effectively CMMC compliant environment. And so it's just, they're authorized in sort of a trickle as opposed to a big, huge, en masse. So we'll continue to see the number increase over the next couple of years, but not quickly.
Yeah, and that's just a good point for everybody to be aware of. These early adopters who are going out and getting their CMMC certifications, a big reason a lot of them are doing it is because they want to get ahead of any sort of possible, something that gets added. They all know that, November 10th is coming, and they want to make sure that they're ready now so they don't have to worry about it in the future. And to your point, it takes a long time to become a certified C3PAO. So, you might want to start thinking about your CMMC assessment if you think you may need one. You're probably soon, I would imagine, right, Tom? Just
Yeah.
based on
Yeah,
availability.
absolutely. I mean, I think most C3POs are, if they haven't filled up their schedule for the rest of the year, I mean, it's pretty close.
Yeah, I
So
was gonna
I
say I
would
don't know of
certainly
any that aren't,
recommend.
yeah, that
Yeah.
aren't full up till the end of the year. Yeah, so it's something to keep in mind if you're planning your CMMC implementation. If you think even a possibility that you're going to have to get an assessment maybe done, in that first year or 2 years, like Michael was discussing, it's probably best to start talking to C3PAOs like Forvis and others out there and see if you can get in the queue. And again, it probably won't be till 2026 anyway that you get in that queue. So it's probably a good idea to have that conversation. Well, I know we sort of alluded to this at the beginning, at the top of the hour, but Michael, I would love for you to go into more of the legal ramifications of what happens if I'm not compliant. Let's say that I have a 70/12 clause right now. Let's say I do not have a 70/21 clause. Just if I have a 70/12 clause, what are the legal ramifications for me not being in compliance with that implementation of NIST 121, the instant response, all the things you discussed at the top of the hour?
Yeah, I mean, I think for our viewers out there, if you're a little bit curious of what the legal ramifications are, all you have to do is go online and search DOJ cyber settlement, and you'll see a myriad of settlements, and the dollar figures and the number of commas might make your jaw drop.
Terrifying. Yeah.
It really is, and the reason being is that back in 2021, the Department of Justice created the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative, and it actually was aimed at focusing on exactly what we were describing earlier on, which was, again, through the 70/12 clause, there was this honor system, but I guess in some instances the department determined there was not a lot of honor because, again, they found that some contractors were not fully implementing the requirements that they thought they were. And the government was sort of saying, we thought that we contracted for this requirement. We gave you the money for it. We included it in there, but we're not seeing that you fully implemented it. And what they're utilizing is a federal statute referred to as the False Claims Act, and it's entirely focused on enforcing that government contracts and services, that whatever the government contracts for, that they're actually getting what they paid for, and where they didn't, that they're bringing forth these enforcement actions. And so again, since 2021, and that was actually the same exact time that the self-assessment requirements for DoD cybersecurity were released under a separate DFARS clause, and which we refer to as the self-assessment 70/20 clause. That time we began seeing this activity of enforcement, and really where we've seen a lot of these enforcement actions being brought forth is where the Department of Justice has actually conducted either their own internal investigations or through whistleblower complaints. And what we mean by that is internal personnel working at a company that are then reporting to the Department of Justice inconsistencies with the company's cybersecurity compliance. In multiple cases that we've actually represented companies that have had these Department of Justice investigations and activity, we found that in many of those instances, the government, through discovery, have obtained unprivileged cybersecurity assessments from these various companies. And within them, they found inconsistencies. And what we mean by that is through the self-assessment requirements, many companies were stating, yes, we fully implemented everything. We have a perfect score. However, over here, separately in this unprivileged report, the government has found that actually through these assessments that there were various controls that were documented that the company did not meet. And so the government is saying, you told us over here that you met everything. However, this assessor externally told you that you did not, and you did not adjust your score, you did not remedy it. We're going to hold you accountable to that. And we're seeing now these settlements in tens of millions of dollars. This is all under the DFAR 70/12 clause, the self-assessment requirements, or the SPURS score, as we often hear. That's where we're seeing much of this activity. Again, when we look future state, though, to CMMC, there are many parallels that I think companies should be very mindful of. The first being self-assessment requirements. Again, for a lot of the companies that we counsel, we've seen that many were doing their best and thought that they were actually assessing accurately. However, there were fundamental flaws and misunderstandings of how they interpreted the controls versus how the government determines controls to be accurately implemented. So too would follow under this first year right now of having CMMC self-assessments. I see a lot of potential risk for companies that they may be inadvertently scoring themselves too high or not understanding their scope or their network boundaries, such that, again, they may be inadvertently scoring themselves in a way that they've met the controls when they've not. So I think that that's something to be mindful of with regards to this whole area of enforcement for cybersecurity.
Oh, absolutely. Honesty is your best friend in the Spurs score. Yeah,
Yep.
that's something we tell our customers all the time. So anybody listening, if you take nothing else away from this conversation, always be as honest as you can in your Spurs score. If you have not fully implemented a control or an objective, do not list it as fully implemented in Spurs because just to sort of circle back to this, we know that 7021 is going to come out and obviously we're still going to have 7012 though, right, Michael? That's not going anywhere. So
Correct.
from a 7012 perspective, I just want to make sure that those people who might be out there right now going, well, I've still got like 2 years with CMMC, like I'm not that worried about it, like it's fine. What has been happening lately? Because I know that we have customers who've been having this experience quite a bit this year. Something about the DIBCAC and doing random assessments with people. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that just to let everybody know?
Yeah, happy to. So, as I mentioned earlier, under the 70/20 clause, which is in many of your contracts, again, if you're already handling controlled and classified information, if you have the 70/12 clause, you likely or you should have also the 70/20 clause. And what that requires, as we mentioned earlier, it requires companies to self-assess their assessments purely against NIST Standard 171, the assessment guide, 171A, and then to upload a score into SPURS, the Supplier Performance Risk System. But the other aspect that some companies overlook that this clause also provides is that government audit function. And that audit function is carried out through DIBCAC, the Defense Industrial Based Cybersecurity Assessment Center. These DIBCAC audits can be conducted now. Something else that I think is notable that some may not understand is that even if you have an external C3PO certification, the government still has the right to conduct a DIBCAC audit, wherein the government can conduct that and their finding would still supersede that of a C3PAO. And so I think it's important to note that, again, just having your CMMC certificate is sort of, you're not done. The race isn't over. There still is a burden of maintaining compliance. But even more than that, too, I think the other point I would sort of point out is when you're having your CMMC assessment, your certification is only as good and accurate and complete as the information you provide to your assessor. Meaning, if you, again, are unclear about your scoping, or if you have other applications, for instance, that CUI may flow to, that your assessor may be unaware of, if they're blind to that and they're still giving you a passing score, separately, if the DIVCAT came and audited that and found that, you would be held liable and found in non-compliance.
Absolutely. I think you made such a good point. These two things are still going to exist in parallel. So you're going
Correct.
to have your CMMC assessment that you have to do. And to Tom's point, if something changes between, your first CMMC assessment and your third, your next CMMC assessment, and DIBCAT comes in and finds that, and you haven't done a reassessment and you haven't, if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, the DIBCAC will always be able to come and knock on your door as part of that contract. So that's something to really be aware of. It's not that one takes over the other. They both exist in parallel. So I'm really glad that you hit that point because it's an extremely important one. And I know that we don't have so much time left, so I want to jump in sort of to the last section of what we're going to talk about today before we get to Q&A. So we talked about what it means for contractors. We talked about, what are all these different, letters and acronyms mean and everything else and all this legislation and everything. But what do we need to tell our audience to do now? What do we need to be doing right now? If I'm, in the dib and I'm freaking out and oh my gosh, this is going to be real now. What are we telling people to do? Tom, what would you tell someone to do who came to you right now?
Yeah, well, that's a lot of what we've kind of been saying over the last couple of years. Frankly, it's we're there now, right? I mean, it's now time to actually get across the finish line with at least the initial assessment. But if someone came to me and said, "Well, we haven't really done anything. We've been waiting for this to officially drop.
Heard that a lot. Yep.
It absolutely starts with understanding the scope of your environment, the nature of the information that you have. Confirming if it's controlled unclassified information, if it's CUI to get you to level 2, then you start to understand, okay, who has access to it? Where does it sit? What third-party service providers do we have that touch it? Within our own organization, who can touch it, and so forth. So you sort of paint the picture around the CUI environment and start to think about some boundaries around it. And then a gap assessment, frankly, against NIST 800-171 is sort of that second step. Okay, so we know where the information is, the systems that are involved. Are we implementing controls effectively? And you could be doing very well if you're a cybersecurity mature organization, or potentially not so much if you're not. And so your score might be lower, but you've got to get the initial perspective so that you can then remediate the issues. And it can take a long time. It can take a year, kind of depending upon what it
Absolutely.
looks like. You may have to stand up a new environment, a new enclave, if you will, implement new processes, controls, documentation. It can take a while. So start to think about having support for that, third-party service providers that consult well and can help you build that. And then from there, you want to start to move toward that 110 score, making sure you've remediated everything and get to that third-party C3PAO assessment.
And sort of what you just, and thank you for that. And what you alluded to, which I definitely want to make a point about is, you may be the type of organization that can do all of this by yourself, and that is great. If you have an IT team, cybersecurity experts, maybe you have a Michael or a Tom who's on your staff. That is amazing if you do. But most, especially those smaller and mid-sized companies that I'm sure are out there listening right now, they may not have a dedicated IT team or anybody who knows anything about any of this kind of stuff. So I know that for us at PreVeil, we have sort of our fast track to compliance where we make sort of a DIY compliance, if you will. If you want to try to do it yourself. However, even with our do it yourself, we still have plenty of companies that need additional assistance. So what kind of assistance, Tom, could companies like Forvis offer to these different companies who are trying to fast track their compliance?
What would we offer? Yeah, we're typically sort of the advisor when we are not the C3PAO assessor for an organization. So we do a lot of gap assessments, POAM, remediation, advisory, project management, things like that. We can certainly help coordinate that where we're not conducting the assessment as well. But definitely you want to look for experienced resources that have been in the CMMC game for a little while.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. And I definitely, and Michael, just to add to this, this is just a quick question, thought that I've had too. There are definitely a lot of companies out there that do consulting. I'm sure that some of them are better than others. So you were discussing sort of the legal ramifications when, hey, if I do my self-assessment wrong, there could be legal ramifications if you have a consultant who does things wrong, correct?
Feel like you were reading my mind. So I really do appreciate this question. And again, I love our CMMC ecosystem. Again, like I mentioned, I'm on the appeals board at the Cyber AB, so I'm really dialed into the CMMC world and have a lot of respect and heart for it. And back to your question, I mean, what I will say, I think I tell people to analogize it again. If you're going to have surgery, right? Think of it as a medical professional. Would you sort of just go to any doctor to do open heart surgery, or would you go to one that's actually done it, 2,000 times, or one that, just a week ago just got their degree and you're the first patient? Would you want that to be the case? And I think it does matter who has experience and their background. I think because the ecosystem is new and it's growing, it's wonderful that we have kind of a burgeoning kind of team of professionals that are growing in this system. But I think it's important to really vet whom you're working with and understand, do they have the requisite credentials? Do they have the requisite experience? And do they have, a good track record? Are they reputable? Because again, one is not the same. One point I would go back to as well, sort of with what Tom was mentioning too, with regards to readiness assessments. I think something else that we recommend to a lot of clients, again, is if you're sort of coming into compliance and things are not entirely perfect, it may be beneficial to consider having a privilege readiness assessment. And what that would look like would be, again, in the instance where Tom was mentioning, if he was not a C3PAO, if he was going to be an assessor, then partnering with an outside, law firm that has a technical capability like Crowell or another, where then they would enter into a trust tri-party agreement such that, again, that assessment would be for the furtherance of legal services. That's important because what it does is it creates a no-fault environment such that, again, you can work through these sort of situations where you might identify gaps. And again, it's not punitive, meaning, again, if there were to be any type of discovery down the road from the government, all those findings would not be discoverable. The same, too, like even using a firm that has those internal capabilities could also be beneficial.
That's a really good point, and I think a lot of people haven't thought about that. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. And when we're, just a shameless plug of PreVeil for the partner side. So we have a partner network that is extensive. So when you were talking, about working with different consultants, because yeah, this CMMC ecosystem is amazing, and we have some incredible people out there. But to your point,
Definitely.
so some people are just starting out, or maybe they don't understand everything as much. Maybe they haven't been here since the beginning, like you and I and Tom
Yeah.
have, right? So we actually here at PreVeil have a vetted partner network, which you both are member, both a part of. So we have partners who we actually work with and make sure they understand PreVeil as a product and our compliance solution, our posture on security, everything. So if you are a PreVeil customer currently, or you're thinking about becoming one, we definitely have all of our partners listed. Forvis is definitely on that list if you're looking for C3PAO, if you're looking for any sort of legal advice or legal assistance. Definitely, Crowell is a wonderful solution provider. So I know that we do want to leave time for questions, and we have so many questions that people submitted before we started this. And also, I know we have, gosh, a few others in the Q&A. So first of all, I just want to thank Tom, Michael. Thank you guys so much for all of your expertise in having this conversation. And Orly, whenever you're ready, we can start diving into some questions if you'd like.
All right. I'll just echo our thanks to Tom and Michael. You guys did a great job. All right. So I will take a couple minutes for questions and then we'll proceed to the breakout rooms. So here's one question. And this is probably best for Tom. Which controls are C3PAs finding the most issues with?
Gosh, that's a good question. I mean, they're across the board. It's you think that often it's a technical control, but a lot of the time it's process and procedure and/or documentation related. So we've encountered a couple of assessments where, for example, the incident response plan looked good, but it wasn't tested, which is a requirement, and so they hadn't tested it. So that's something that you can put a poem around, and we had to kind of work through a poem closeout assessment to get through it. There's others where just the documentation did not line up with what's going on in reality and actually in production. And so in those instances, you can actually do a limited deficiency correction during the assessment week and actually correct incorrect documentation. So there, things like that. I will say that, you know, typically we don't get too far into an assessment and find a whole bunch of issues that would result in a failed assessment. That's the point of the readiness review. If your system security plan really reflects reality, when we do the early part, the documentation review, we'll identify if there are significant problems and we'll call it out there. So it typically, I would say, is probably more around process and procedure more than it is technology, at least in these early assessments.
All right, great. Here's another one. Is there going to be a grace period involved with CMMCs? And I take this to mean that on November 10th, we'll start seeing it in contracts. And if someone's already started on their journey, how much of a grace period might they expect, or will that not be possible?
It's a good question. I mean, there's Michael, you probably have some perspective as well, but we talked about the waivers. So there is the potential for that as part of a contracting officer's duty. I think DoD is sensitive to the rollout timeline and the availability of the C3PAO ecosystem, I should say. So I think they will try to track to availability of C3PAOs if possible. But I mean, as far as asking contracting officers for extensions, I don't know how much grace would be given there. Michael, I'd be curious on your perspective from a legal perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think my thought is this really depends upon the specific contract. I mean, so there really is no one singular answer. But I mean, I think the other component to this too is, even aside from an external C3PO assessment, there could be a requirement to conduct a self-assessment. And it's really more of a matter, is the company mature enough, like from a cybersecurity perspective, to actually have the documentation and to have the controls implemented to be able to conduct that assessment accurately and to meet the requisite requirements. And if not, you may need to forego future contracting opportunities until you're able to. Because again, the government has been clear that sort of going forward, this is a go, no go requirement. So in some ways to think about it, it's more of a cost of doing business.
Okay, we'll take one or two more questions and then we'll move on to the breakout room. So here's one that I'd like kind of everyone's perspective on. Do we have a current statistic on how many organizations have received and passed their CMMC level 2 C3PAO assessment?
Feels like a test question. I remember I heard a number a while back, but I know I'm sure it keeps going up, up, up. So I don't know. Tom,
It
do you have a
does.
read?
It's a couple hundred. Matt Travis, the CEO of the Cyber AB, gives an update on that during his monthly town halls, which I think are the last Tuesday of every month. And he typically has a table of number of successful assessments, conditional certificates, and failed assessments, I think, are included in that number. I don't have an exact figure, but the number is ticking up slowly into the couple hundred probably.
Okay. And here's actually one that I think is we've spoken about in other venues, but I think can be relevant to today. So with CMMC coming online, should we expect other government agencies or even other countries to start enforcing similar requirements and certifications? And the person goes on to say, in the past month, we have received similar questionnaires for non-DoD organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fair game for multiple reasons. I mean, the first being, and I think we didn't really cover this earlier on, but I mean, the CMMC clause was technically around since 21. It's been dormant. But at that time, when there was sort of notice and comment periods, even at that time, GSA, the General Services Administration, began including it in their solicitation requirements. So, I mean, I think that there was already a trend for other agencies to begin adopting it, but even more so, pointing towards another pending rule. There's a pending FAR CUI rule right now that essentially would apply these same underlying cyber requirements to every civilian agency. That's still going through rulemaking, and it's again unsettled sort of how that will entirely mirror up with the CMMC program itself, but the same underlying requirements are sort of in motion already.
The NIST 800-171 framework will be the underlying requirement for really across the board, but it doesn't include that third-party C3PAO. I think that's kind of one of the big rocks. It doesn't initially require a C3PAO assessment.
In the draft rule. So we have to
In the
wait to
draft
see
rule.
it. Yeah,
Yeah,
we have to
that's
see what
true. Yeah.
happens. Yeah.
There can be changes.
A lot of changes go from a draft to final. At least we can say that for even CMMC. We went from 5 to
Agreed.
three levels. So